The wind was a constant, abrasive whisper against the dry, cracked earth. It carried dust and the ghosts of rain that never came, a mocking presence in a land that had forgotten the taste of wetness. Alara pressed a hand to her thin dress, feeling the grit settle on her skin, in her hair. It was late summer, the sun a relentless eye in a bleached sky, but the true season here was desolation. The crops her family had staked everything on had withered to brittle stalks weeks ago. The well was a muddy apology. The bank notice had arrived 2 days later, stark white against the faded wood of their cabin door. Her mother wept silently. Her father, a man worn down to bone and silence by years of fighting this impossible land, simply stared at the horizon. There were younger mouths to feed her sister, small and frail, coughing through the dust. Her brother, barely old enough to swing an axe but already burdened by the family's plight. Alara, at 23, was the eldest. Her options were as barren as the fields. Then the letter came, not from the bank, but from a lawyer in the nearest town, 30 miles across the parched plain. Elias Thorne, a name she knew only as a distant figure, a man who owned one of the largest, if most remote, ranches in the territory. A man known for his solitude, his land's surprising resilience despite the drought, and his unsettling, impenetrable quiet. The letter, brief and to the point, was an offer of marriage. A practical arrangement, it stated, offering security, resources, a future for her family in exchange for her hand. No mention of affection, companionship, or any of the things songs were sung about. It was a transaction, stark and without pretense. Her parents looked at her, hope and despair warring in their eyes. It was not a request. It was a quiet plea from people who had nothing left. The weight of their survival settled on her shoulders, heavier than any harvest basket she had ever carried. She looked at her siblings, their faces smudged with dust and fear. The choice was no choice at all. She wrote back, her hand trembling, accepting the offer from the stranger. She packed her few belongings into a single cloth bundle. A worn Bible, a change of clothes, a small carved wooden bird, a relic of a childhood that felt 1,000 years distant. The journey to the Thorne Ranch was long and bone-jarring in the back of the neighbor's wagon, the only one still with a horse strong enough to make the trip. The landscape blurred into a monotonous expanse of brown and gray, punctuated only by skeletal trees and the occasional distant, shimmering heat haze. With every mile, the familiar world receded, replaced by the daunting unknown. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, tightening with each turn of the wagon wheel. She was going to marry a man she had never spoken a word to, live in a place she had never seen, all to save her family from the slow starvation the land threatened. Her family's desperation was the price of entry to Elias Thorne's world. She clung to the thought of them, imagining them safe, fed, sheltered, telling herself the sacrifice was not a death, but a lifeline. Yet, a part of her mourned the loss of herself, the girl who had dreamed of a life filled with simple joys and perhaps, God willing, love. That girl was being left behind on the dusty road. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, the ranch finally appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a grand place, not in the way she might have imagined for the largest landowner around, but it was substantial. A sturdy, 2-story house built of local stone and timber, a well-maintained corral, several outbuildings, and the barn. It was enormous, casting a long shadow across the yard, built of darker wood, solid and imposing. It seemed to dominate the entire property, a silent sentinel against the vast sky. There was an air about the place, an unnerving stillness despite its size. Felt watchful. Her apprehension, which had been a constant hum, sharpened into a keen edge. This was her new home. This was the life she had traded her freedom for. And the man who waited within its walls was a mystery she was bound to unravel, or be consumed by. The wagon pulled to a halt. The only sound was the wind. No dogs barked, no chickens scratched in the dirt. Just the relentless whisper of the dry air and the pounding of her own heart. She took a deep breath, the dust catching in her throat, and stepped down onto the unforgiving ground. Her new life began now, under the shadow of that immense, silent barn, with a stranger she had promised to wed. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken things. She clutched her bundle tighter, her knuckles white. The house seemed to absorb the last rays of light, its windows like dark eyes. She looked towards the barn again, its presence somehow more potent than the house. There was something about it, a weight, a significance she couldn't yet name. It felt less like a structure for animals and more like a keeper of secrets. The silence stretched, vast and empty, mirroring the landscape. This was not just a marriage. It was an entry into a world apart, governed by its own rules, held together by a man she did not know, and shadowed by a barn that seemed to hold its breath. Her hope, fragile as a spider's web, felt dangerously exposed to the harsh reality unfolding before her. She was here. There was no turning back. Elias Thorne emerged from the house as the wagon pulled away, leaving Alara standing alone in the vast, quiet yard. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, his face etched with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and perhaps a deep-seated solitude. His eyes, a pale, almost startling blue, met hers across the distance. They held no warmth, no welcome, but neither did they hold cruelty. They were simply assessing, like the eyes of an old hawk, calm and observant. He wore practical, worn clothes, denim trousers, a faded shirt, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He carried himself with a quiet competence, his movements spare and deliberate. He said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her. The silence felt immense, pressing in on her from all sides. Alara's breath hitched. This was the man, her husband, the stranger who held her family's future in his hands. She swallowed, trying to find her voice, but the dust and her fear seemed to have stolen it. Finally, he dipped his head, a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "You arrived," he stated, his voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry creek bed. It wasn't a question, just a simple acknowledgement of fact. "The house is ready." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer a hand, didn't smile. He simply turned and walked back towards the door, leaving her to follow. Alara picked up her bundle and walked across the hard-packed dirt, her worn boots crunching softly. The house was indeed ready, but in a sparse, functional way. The main room was dominated by a large stone hearth, cold and empty. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center. A rough-hewn cupboard stood against one wall. Everything was clean, but devoid of any personal touches, any warmth. It felt like a place built for necessity, not comfort or life. He gestured towards a door. "Your room." The room was equally bare. A narrow bed covered with a plain quilt, a small wooden chest, a washbasin on a stand. A single window looked out towards the back of the property, offering a view of the endless, undulating plains and, closer, the imposing rear of the barn. She set her bundle down on the bed. The air inside was stifling, holding the day's heat. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a thin thread. He nodded again, still without expression. "Supper will be when the light fades. I work until then," and with that, he left, the door closing softly behind him. Alone in the silence, Alara felt the full weight of her decision crash down on her. This was not a home. It was a shelter, a transaction made physical. She walked to the window and looked out. Elias was already walking towards the barn, his stride long and unhurried. He didn't glance back. The barn doors, large and solid, seemed to dwarf him as he approached. He opened one just enough to slip inside, and then it closed behind him, cutting him off from view. A profound sense of isolation washed over her. She was utterly alone in this strange, silent house, on this vast, silent ranch, with a silent husband whose only apparent destination was that forbidding barn. The rest of the day stretched before her, empty and intimidating. She unpacked her few things, folded her spare dress, placed the wooden bird on the chest. She found the kitchen small, functional, with a wood-burning stove. Water had to be pumped from a well outside. She found a sack of flour, some dried beans, coffee. Survival was here, but little else. As the light began to soften, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. She heard Elias return. He came into the kitchen, his movements still quiet and contained. He washed his hands at the sink, the water splashing into a metal bucket. He didn't speak until she had prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack. They ate in silence at the table, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the mournful whisper of the wind outside. She stole glances at him. His face was impassive, his eyes focused on his plate. He ate quickly, efficiently. When he finished, he simply pushed his plate away and stood up. "I have work," he said, the same low, gravelly tone. He didn't specify what work. He didn't ask about her day, or her journey, or her family. He simply stated his intention and walked out. He didn't return until much later, after darkness had fallen completely. She had cleaned the kitchen, sat by the cold hearth, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. When he finally came in, she heard him move about in another part of the house. There was no shared living space, no opportunity for conversation or connection. He went to his room, and she remained in hers. The silence between them was a tangible thing, thick and heavy. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling into the night. The wind, the creak of the old house, and, faintly, from the direction of the barn, a sound she couldn't quite place. Not livestock lowing or neighing in the usual way. Something softer, a rustling, a low murmur. Her eyes were drawn to the window overlooking the barn. It was a dark, solid shape against the star-filled sky. What was in there that demanded so much of his time, his solitude, even after the day's light was gone? Her fear of him mingled with a growing, insistent curiosity about the secret life he led within those large, closed doors. This arranged marriage was a cage, but perhaps, she thought, turning away from the window with a sigh that was swallowed by the silence, understanding the bars might make it feel less confining. Or more. Life on the Thorn Ranch settled into a monotonous rhythm dictated by the sun and the demands of the harsh land. Alara quickly learned the routines expected of her. She woke before dawn, built the fire in the kitchen stove, fetched water from the well, prepared their simple meals. She washed clothes by hand, tended a small, struggling vegetable patch near the house, swept the dust that seemed to seep in through every crack. The physical labor was demanding, but it was a welcome distraction from the churning thoughts in her head. Elias worked from sunup to sundown, often later. He spent his days mending fences, checking water troughs, most of which were dry or contained only a muddy residue, tending to the few head of cattle he still had. But a significant portion of his time, sometimes hours at a stretch, was spent in the barn. He would disappear inside, the large door closing firmly behind him, and she wouldn't see him again until necessity or the fading light drew him out. He never invited her in. He never spoke of what he did inside. If she asked, hesitantly, about his work, his answers were brief and vague, usually ending with a gesture towards the barn or a curt statement about needing to see to things. Their conversations remained minimal, functional. "Supper is ready, I need water. There is work in the south pasture." He was not unkind, not verbally abusive, but he was a ghost in his own home. He shared her meals, slept under the same roof, but remained utterly separate, enclosed within his own world, the center of which seemed to be the barn. Alara, observing him from a distance, both literally and figuratively, saw a man deeply connected to the land, despite its cruelty. He moved through it with a quiet authority, understanding its moods, its subtle signs. He was patient with the struggling animals, methodical in his tasks. There was a competency about him that was undeniable, a quiet strength that she began, grudgingly, to respect. But the mystery of the barn remained. It was a constant, silent question mark. Why did he spend so much time there? What work could possibly require such solitude and secrecy? The usual activities of a barn, tending to livestock, storing hay, mending equipment, didn't seem to account for his prolonged absences inside its walls. And those sounds. Sometimes, when the wind died down, she would hear them. Faint rustlings, soft movements, sometimes a low, almost melodic sound she couldn't identify. It wasn't the bleating of sheep or the familiar lowing of cattle. It was something different, something wilder, quieter. Her imagination, fueled by loneliness and the vast emptiness surrounding her, began to conjure possibilities. Was he hiding something illegal? Was there someone else in there? The fear that had initially dominated her feelings towards him began to intertwine with a deep, unsettling curiosity. She needed to know. The not knowing was worse than almost anything she could imagine. It created a barrier between them, a silent wall that prevented any possibility of understanding, of connection. And connection, however fragile, was something she craved in this desolate place. She thought of her family, the reason she was here. She wrote to them when she could, sending the letters with the infrequent rider who passed their way towards town. She didn't speak of her fear or her loneliness, only that she was safe and provided for. She received sparse replies, detailing the slow improvement in their lives, the worry lessening like a physical weight. Their safety was the anchor she clung to, the justification for her life here. But it didn't fill the emptiness of the house, or the silence of the man she was bound to. One afternoon, while Elias was away working the far pasture, she found herself drawn towards the barn. The sun beat down, and the air shimmered with heat. She stood outside the large doors, her heart pounding against her ribs. The wood felt rough under her fingertips. It smelled of old hay, dust, and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. She considered trying the latch, but fear held her rooted to the spot. What if he returned? What if what was inside was dangerous? She retreated, her curiosity unsatisfied but burning hotter. Elias returned later, his clothes dusty, sweat staining his shirt. He looked tired, lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. For a moment, as he met her gaze across the yard, she saw something flicker there, something other than his usual stoicism, perhaps weariness, perhaps a hint of something akin to vulnerability. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual reserved demeanor. But that fleeting glimpse stayed with her. It reminded her that he was a man, not just an enigma, a man carrying his own burdens, his own secrets. And the largest secret, she felt certain, resided within the walls of that immense, silent barn. The need to understand him and the life he lived was growing stronger, overcoming her initial fear. It was no longer just about the secret itself, but about bridging the chasm between them, finding a way to exist not just alongside him, but perhaps eventually with him. The barn stood as a physical manifestation of that distance, a challenge she felt increasingly compelled to meet. The relentless drought tightened its grip on the land. The small vegetable patch Alara tended wilted despite her efforts, the earth too hard and dry to absorb the scarce water she hauled from the well. The cattle grew thinner, their ribs prominent beneath their hides. The constant wind seemed to carry not just dust, but the sound of the land groaning under the strain. Yet, amidst the widespread decline, the Thorn Ranch seemed to fare marginally better than its neighbors. Elias still had water in his well, though it was low. His remaining cattle, while lean, weren't dying. There was a quiet resilience about his portion of the land, an almost imperceptible difference that set it apart. Alara noticed this, pondering the reason. Was it simply luck? Or was it somehow connected to Elias's tireless work, and perhaps to the secret he kept? Her thoughts returned inevitably to the barn. The sounds she sometimes heard from it seemed more pronounced now, perhaps because the rest of the world was so unnaturally quiet. She heard soft footfalls, muffled snorts, a rhythmic chewing, sounds that didn't quite fit with the single aging horse and few head of cattle that sometimes grazed near the house. One evening, as they ate their silent supper, she ventured a question, her voice hesitant. "Elias," she began, then paused, unsure how to phrase it. He looked up, his pale eyes steady on hers. Is everything well with the animals in the barn?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "They are cared for," he finally replied, his tone neutral, giving nothing away. The answer was evasive, a confirmation that there were indeed animals, but offering no detail, no hint of what kind or how many, or why they required such secrecy. It was a polite dismissal of her curiosity. Frustration mingled with her persistent need to know. This wall of silence, this constant withholding, was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just about a secret anymore. It was about his refusal to let her in, to share even the smallest part of his life beyond the purely transactional. Their marriage was a shell, and she yearned for substance, for connection in this desolate place. One sweltering afternoon, while Elias was far out on the range, checking the fences along the property line, Alara decided she could wait no longer. The need to know had become an ache in her chest. She had finished her chores, and the house felt stifling, oppressive in its silence. She walked towards the barn, her steps slow and deliberate. The midday sun beat down on her head, but she barely noticed. All her focus was on the large wooden doors. She reached them, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped the heavy iron latch. It was stiff, but yielded with a groan of old wood. She pushed the door inward just a crack, peering into the gloom. The air inside was cooler, surprisingly fresh, carrying the scent of clean straw and something else, a wild, earthy aroma that was both foreign and strangely compelling. She slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. The vast main section of the barn was filled with stalls, mostly empty. A few held the ranch's workhorse and a couple of older cows, chewing placidly. Piles of hay were neatly stacked. Tools hung on the walls. Everything seemed ordinary. Disappointment pricked at her. Had she imagined the sounds, the secrecy? Had the isolation simply preyed on her mind? But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something else. Along the back wall, where she had expected to see more stalls or perhaps storage, was a section that seemed different. The wall here was built of heavier timber, fitted together with unusual care. There was a narrow gap, almost invisible, running vertically in the wood, indicating a hidden door. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was it, the hidden part, the secret. She approached the wall, her footsteps muffled by the straw on the floor. She ran her fingers along the wood, searching for a latch or handle. It was cleverly concealed, a small, almost flush wooden peg near the floor. She pressed it, and a section of the wall, large enough for a person to pass through, swung silently inward on well-oiled hinges. A wave of cooler, damper air flowed out, carrying that same wild, earthy scent, now stronger. Beyond the opening was darkness. A steep, narrow ramp led downwards. The air felt different down there, heavier, richer with the smell of damp earth and living things. Trepidation warred with her burning curiosity. Every instinct screamed caution, warned her to turn back, to close the door and pretend she had never seen it. But the need to understand Elias, to penetrate the mystery that defined her new life, was stronger. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Alara stepped through the hidden opening and began to descend into the cool, silent darkness below the barn. The wooden door swung shut behind her, plunging her into near-total blackness, save for a faint light filtering from somewhere deeper within. She was committed now. The secret was waiting. The ramp descended into a large, cavernous space beneath the barn. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, fresh straw, and the distinct, musky odor of wild animals. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering from strategically placed vents in the ceiling, cleverly disguised above ground, Alara's breath caught in her throat. This was not a typical basement or storage area. It was a hidden sanctuary. Spread out below her was a series of large pens, each filled with a deep layer of clean straw. And in those pens, moving with a quiet grace she had never witnessed before, were animals. They weren't cattle or horses. They were a type of antelope, unlike any she had seen described or pictured. Their coats were a beautiful mottled gray-brown, allowing them to blend seamlessly with the dry landscape above. But their most striking feature was their horns, long, spiraling, and incredibly elegant. There were about a dozen of them, dozen yearlings, gathered around several large stone troughs filled with water. The water looked clear and fresh, a shocking sight in this drought-stricken land. These were the source of the strange sounds, the reason for Elias's secrecy, the occupants of the hidden world beneath the barn. They were magnificent creatures, their eyes large and dark, observing her with a calm wariness, not panic. It was clear they were accustomed to Elias, accustomed to this hidden life. Alara descended fully into the space, moving slowly, not wanting to startle them. The silence of the barn above was explained. He kept them here, protected, watered, unseen. But why? Why these specific animals? And why hide them? She approached one of the pens, kneeling by the rough-hewn fence. A doe watched her, twitching a long, sensitive ear. She reached out a tentative hand. The doe didn't flinch away, but remained still, its gaze steady. Alara felt a profound sense of awe. In a world where everything was dying, where the land itself seemed to be giving up, these animals were thriving, healthy, vibrant. They were life, hidden away, protected from the harshness above. "They are called water seekers," a voice said from behind her. Alara spun around, startled. Elias stood at the bottom of the ramp, his face grim, his pale eyes dark with concern and something else she couldn't read, perhaps disappointment, perhaps resignation. He must have returned early, found the barn door ajar and followed her. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. "Elias, I didn't," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. He held up a hand, stopping her panicked explanation. He didn't seem angry, just weary. "You found my secret," he stated, his voice flat. He walked towards her, his gaze sweeping over the animals. I heard sounds," she managed, her voice softer now, looking from him back to the beautiful creatures. "And you spend so much time. I didn't understand." "No one understands," he said, his voice low. He walked to the edge of a pen, reaching out a hand towards a young male with burgeoning horns. The antelope stepped closer, nudging his palm. There was a clear bond between them. "These animals," he continued, turning back to her, his eyes holding a flicker of intensity she hadn't seen before. "They are the key. The old ones, the ones who lived on this land for centuries before we came. They knew. These creatures, the water seekers, they have an instinct, a knowledge of where water lies deep underground. In a drought like this, they can find sources no human could." He paused, looking around the cavern. "My grandfather knew of them. He taught my father. When this drought started years ago, worsening each year, I knew what I had to do. The wild herds were being decimated. Poachers, desperate ranchers killing them for meat, misunderstanding what they were. I managed to capture a small group, brought them here, built this place to protect them." He gestured around the hidden space. "They need water to find water. I dug a deep well here, just for them. They lead me sometimes, not directly, but their movements, their restlessness, they point the way. It's how I've kept my well from running dry, how I find water for the few cattle I have left." Alara listened, mesmerized. It was a story of quiet desperation, of a man fighting against the tide, clinging to ancient knowledge and a fragile hope. "But why the secret?" she asked softly. "Why hide them from everyone?" Elias's face hardened. "Because people are greedy," he said, his voice bitter. "If others knew, they wouldn't see the key to the land's survival. They'd see meat or a resource to be exploited. They'd hunt them, capture them, destroy the very instinct that makes them valuable. The government has programs to manage wildlife, but they wouldn't understand these. They'd be taken, studied, perhaps killed. They are safer hidden. Their instinct is safer protected." He looked at her, his pale eyes searching hers. "This is dangerous, Alara. If anyone knew I was keeping these animals, there would be trouble. Accusations, perhaps even attempts to take them, or worse, the weight of the secret, and the danger it entailed, settled heavily upon her. It wasn't just his secret anymore. It was hers too, by discovery, by marriage. The silent, stoic man she had married was not just a rancher, but a protector, a keeper of a vital, dangerous secret. And in that moment, understanding dawned, pushing aside the fear. She saw not a distant stranger, but a man driven by a deep connection to the land and a quiet determination to preserve something precious and vital. even at great personal risk. The wall between them had crumbled, replaced by the shared weight of his secret, the shared understanding of the fragile life he was trying to preserve beneath the dying world above. Elara remained in the hidden chamber for a long time after Elias finished speaking, her mind reeling from the revelation. She watched the water-seekers move gracefully in their pens, the sound of their quiet breathing and the rhythmic lapping of water from the troughs filling the silence between her and Elias. The air in this subterranean world felt cooler, cleaner, a stark contrast to the dusty heat above ground. It was a pocket of life in a landscape of death, a fragile hope nurtured in secrecy. She looked at Elias. He was leaning against the pen fence, his gaze fixed on the animals, his expression unreadable. He seemed less guarded here, more present. The stoicism was still there, a deep-seated part of him, but beneath it, she now saw the fierce dedication, the quiet burden he carried alone. "They are beautiful," she said softly, finally breaking the silence. He turned his head, meeting her eyes. A flicker of something unnameable crossed his face, perhaps surprise that she wasn't demanding he get rid of them, or fear for her reaction. "They are," he agreed, his voice still low, "and vital, not just to this land, but perhaps to understanding how to survive when everything else fails." He didn't elaborate, but she understood. These animals were more than just a resource. They were a symbol of resilience, a living link to the land's deepest secrets. "You have kept this secret for a long time," she stated, not as a question, but an observation. "Since the drought began to bite deep," he confirmed. "Years." He looked tired, the lines on his face seeming deeper in the dim light. "It is a lonely burden," she ventured, a quiet statement of empathy. His pale eyes met hers again. For the first time, she saw a hint of the man beneath the facade. "Yes," he admitted, the single word carrying the weight of years of solitude and vigilance. Very lonely in that moment. The transactional nature of their marriage seemed to fade, replaced by a fragile thread of shared understanding. They were two solitary figures in a vast, empty landscape, bound together by circumstance and now, by a dangerous secret. Her initial fear of him had dissipated, replaced by a complex mix of apprehension, respect, and a nascent sense of kinship. She had married him to save her family, but in discovering his secret, she had found something unexpected. A glimpse into the soul of the man she had wed, and a shared purpose that transcended the initial agreement. "What do you need?" she asked, the words surprising even herself. He looked at her, his expression one of quiet astonishment. "Need to care for them," she clarified, gesturing to the animals. "What do you need?" "I can help." His gaze searched her face, looking for any sign of deceit or fear. He seemed to find none. "Straw," he said finally, his voice regaining a hint of its usual practicality. "Water. They need specific fodder sometimes, not just hay. Things I have to collect." "Show me," she said, stepping closer to the pens. "Show me what you do." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. It was an invitation, a quiet acceptance of her offer. He walked her through the hidden space, explaining the system of vents, the depth of the well, the specific needs of the water seekers. He showed her where the special fodder plants grew, sparse but resilient, higher on the rocky slopes. He spoke of their behavior, their sensitivity, their need for quiet and darkness. As he spoke, his passion for these creatures, his dedication to their survival, was evident in his voice, in the way he looked at them. He was a different man here, beneath the ground, away from the world's judgment and the land's cruelty. Elara listened, absorbing every word. She asked questions, showing a genuine interest that seemed to surprise him. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath her skin, the knowledge of the danger ever present. But it was tempered by a growing sense of purpose. She was no longer just a wife in a marriage of convenience. She was a partner in a secret mission, a guardian of a fragile hope. Working together in the hidden chamber, even just talking about it, chipped away at the wall between them. They were speaking, truly speaking, for the first time. sharing knowledge, planning tasks, operating as a unit. It was the foundation of a connection, built not on grand gestures or whispered endearments, but on shared labor, mutual necessity, and the quiet understanding of a dangerous secret. The air in the hidden chamber felt less oppressive now, filled not just with the scent of earth and animals, but with the faint, fragile promise of something new growing between them. Alara began spending a portion of each day in the hidden chamber beneath the barn. Elias showed her how to clean the pens, distribute the special fodder, and monitor the water seekers for any signs of distress. It was hard work, but it was work with a purpose, a stark contrast to the often futile labor above ground. The animals grew accustomed to her presence, losing their initial wariness, sometimes even approaching her cautiously. She learned to recognize their individual markings, their subtle behaviors. Caring for them filled a void within her, offering a sense of connection she hadn't realized how desperately she craved. Elias and Alara fell into a new routine, one that revolved around the needs of the hidden herd. Their interactions, once minimal and stilted, became more fluid, though still sparse in words. They communicated through shared tasks, quiet gestures, the silent understanding that passed between them as they worked side by side. He would point out a task. She would perform it without question. She would notice a need. He would acknowledge it with a nod. The silence between them was no longer empty or oppressive, but filled with unspoken understanding and a quiet companionship. They would eat their meals together, and sometimes he would speak of the water seekers, sharing observations about their behavior, their resilience. He spoke with a quiet passion that revealed more about the man he was than any conversation about the weather or ranch work ever could. She learned that he saw these animals as more than just a resource. He saw them as a part of the land's soul, a connection to a wildness that was slowly being extinguished by human encroachment and the relentless drought. His secret wasn't born of greed or malice, but of a deep-seated respect for the natural world and a desperate hope for its survival. Their shared work, their shared secret, forged a bond between them stronger than any legal document. The transactional marriage was quietly, implicitly transforming into a partnership. Alara began to see Elias not as the intimidating stranger, but as a man burdened by a profound responsibility, a protector with a quiet strength that resonated with her own burgeoning resilience. The harshness of the land still surrounded them, the drought a constant threat, but within the hidden chamber, there was a sense of sanctuary, a pocket of defiance against the dying world. One afternoon, while helping Elias gather the specific plants the water seekers needed from the rocky slopes, Alara stumbled, twisting her ankle painfully. She cried out, falling to the ground. Elias was instantly at her side, kneeling beside her. His usual reserve was gone, replaced by immediate concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice sharp with worry. He carefully examined her ankle, his touch surprisingly gentle. "It's twisted," he stated. "You'll need to favor it." He helped her up, supporting her weight as they slowly made their way back to the house. For the first time, he insisted she rest, bringing her water and a cool cloth for her forehead. He took over all the chores, working tirelessly to manage both the ranch above ground and the hidden world below. Watching him, seeing his quiet care and his willingness to shoulder the extra burden without complaint, deepened Alara's respect for him. He was not just capable but fundamentally decent. He had not abandoned her family. He had not abandoned her. He had simply been a man carrying a heavy load alone, unsure how to share it. And now they were sharing it. During the days her ankle healed, confined mostly to the house, she had more time to think, to observe him from a distance. She saw the weary slump of his shoulders as he returned from a long day, the way his gaze often drifted towards the barn, a silent check on his secret charges. She saw the quiet determination in his movements. The forced rest also made her realize how deeply intertwined her life had become with his, with the ranch, with the secret. She was no longer just enduring. She was invested. The fate of the water seekers, and by extension, the fate of this fragile ecosystem and their own future on this land, felt like her fate too. When her ankle was healed enough for her to return to her tasks, Elias met her in the kitchen one morning before the sun had fully risen. He didn't speak right away, simply poured himself coffee and stood by the hearth, nursing the warm mug in his hands. Alara waited, sensing a shift in the air, a weight to the silence that was different from their usual quietude. Finally, he looked at her, his pale eyes steady in the dim light. "Alara," he began, his voice low, "the water seekers, they depend on this secret. And now, you are part of it." He paused, searching for the right words. "This is not the life you expected. I know that." This marriage, he trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate the complexities of their arrangement. Alara stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "I understand, Elias," she said softly. "I understand what you are doing, and I believe in it." A flicker of surprise, then perhaps relief, softened his features. You do." "Yes," she affirmed, her voice gaining strength. "This land is dying. These animals, they are hope. What you are doing is important." She hesitated, then took a small step closer. And you are not the man I feared." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw the layers of reserve begin to peel back. "And you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are stronger than you know." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way of songs and stories, but in this place, between these two people, it was a profound acknowledgement, a recognition of shared burdens and mutual respect. It was the moment their partnership, born of necessity and forged in secrecy, truly began. The silence that followed was different, not empty, but full of unspoken understanding. A fragile bridge built between them in the quiet heart of the dying land. The fragile peace they had built, centered around the secret of the water seekers, was constantly shadowed by the threat of discovery. The drought continued, the land parched and brittle. Neighbors grew more desperate, their eyes scanning every horizon for signs of water, for any advantage. Word began to circulate in the nearest town of strange occurrences on the Thorn Ranch. Whispers of water where there should be none, of Elias Thorn's inexplicable resilience in the face of the widespread ruin. Suspicion was a seed easily planted in the dry earth of desperate minds. One sweltering afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as he approached the ranch house. He was a man Alara recognized from her old town, Jedediah Cobb, a rancher whose own livestock had perished weeks ago, leaving him bitter and resentful. He dismounted slowly, his eyes narrowed, scanning the property, lingering on the barn. Elias emerged from the house, his posture wary. Alara stood beside him, a knot tightening in her stomach. "Thorn," Cobb greeted, his voice rough. "Heard you're faring better than most. Got water, I hear." "We manage," Elias replied, his tone even, giving nothing away. Cobb's gaze fixed on the barn. "That's a mighty big barn. Must hold a lot of stock to keep a man busy through times like these." His eyes were probing, suspicious. Alara felt a chill despite the heat. This was it, the threat materializing. "Holds what I need," Elias said simply, his hand resting casually, but purposefully, near the axe leaning against the porch post. Cobb's gaze darted to the axe, then back to Elias's impassive face. He sensed the quiet warning. He kicked at the dusty ground. "Seems unnatural, Thorn. Seems like you got something others ain't." He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. "Some say you got something hidden, something valuable." He glanced towards the barn again. Alara held her breath. Elias's gaze was steady, unwavering. "People say a lot of things when they're scared, Cobb," he said, his voice low but carrying an steel edge. "This land is hard. Survival ain't easy. I work it." Cobb lingered for a few more tense moments, his eyes moving back and forth between Elias and the barn, clearly unconvinced but also unwilling to push further against Elias's quiet, formidable presence. Finally, with a grunt of frustration, he remounted his horse. "I'll be seeing you around, Thorn," he said, his voice a veiled threat. "This drought ain't over. People get desperate." He turned his horse and rode away, the dust he raised a testament to his bitterness. Alara watched him go, her heart still pounding. When he was out of sight, She turned to Elias, her face pale. "He suspects," she whispered. Elias nodded grimly. "He's not the only one. Desperation breeds suspicion." He looked towards the barn, his expression hardening. "We have to be more careful." The encounter underscored the precariousness of their situation. The secret, their source of hope, was also their greatest vulnerability. The days that followed were filled with heightened tension. Elara and Elias worked with a renewed sense of urgency, gathering more fodder for the water seekers, reinforcing the hidden door's disguise, checking the vents for any sign of tampering. Elara found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The fear was still present, a constant companion, but it no longer paralyzed her. Instead, it fueled her determination to protect the fragile life they were nurturing, to protect Elias, to protect the hope they represented. She was no longer the vulnerable girl who had arrived here. She was a partner, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband against the encroaching danger. Her internal monologue shifted from despair and fear to quiet resolve and vigilance. She watched the horizons constantly, listening for any approaching sound. She learned to read Elias's subtle cues, anticipating his needs, working in silent coordination. Their bond deepened under the pressure, a silent, powerful affirmation of their shared purpose. One night, a week after Cobb's visit, Elara woke to a sound that didn't belong, the faint jingle of spurs outside, the creak of the barn door opening slowly. Elias was instantly awake beside her. They exchanged a silent, urgent look. Someone was trying to get into the barn. It was the moment they had feared. The climax was upon them, not a dramatic shootout, but a tense, silent confrontation in the darkness. The secret was under direct threat, and they would have to face the danger together, relying on their wits, their knowledge of the barn's hidden layout, and the quiet partnership they had forged in the face of hardship. Their future, and the future of the water seekers, hung in the balance. The creak of the barn door was agonizingly slow, amplified in the deep silence of the night. Elias slipped out of bed, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Elara was right behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no time for fear, only action. They moved through the dark house, their bare feet silent on the wooden floors, converging in the main room. Elias grabbed the rifle he kept leaning by the hearth. Elara seized a heavy iron poker. He looked at her, his pale eyes gleaming in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "Stay here," he mouthed, his voice a low whisper. She shook her head, her resolve firm.
"No."
"We face this together." He hesitated for a split second, reading the fierce determination in her eyes. He gave a short, sharp nod, an acceptance of her partnership in this danger. They crept to the back door, the one facing the barn. The faint glow of a lantern flickered inside the large structure. Voices, low and muffled, drifted on the wind. More than one person. Poachers, perhaps, or desperate men looking for anything of value. Elias eased the door open. The night air was cool against Elara's skin. They moved silently across the yard, keeping to the shadows between the outbuildings. The barn doors were partially open now, a rectangle of faint, dusty light spilling out. 3 figures were visible inside, their backs to the door, one holding the lantern aloft. They were moving towards the back wall, towards the hidden entrance. They knew. Cobb must have shared his suspicions, perhaps even the location of the secret wall if he had observed Elias long enough. Panic flared, sharp and sudden. They couldn't let them find the water seekers. Elias gripped her arm, a silent instruction. They circled around the barn, using its vast bulk as cover, moving towards the opposite side. There was a smaller, rarely used entrance there, near where Elias kept his tools. They slipped inside, the interior a maze of deep shadows and familiar forms. The sounds of the intruders were closer now, their voices slightly louder as they searched the back wall. "It's gotta be here somewhere." Cobb said he spends all his time back here. "Looks like solid wall. There's gotta be a catch, a lever." Elias moved swiftly, silently, towards the back section. Elara followed, her poker held tightly in her hand, her senses hyper-alert. They reached the back wall, staying hidden behind stacked hay bales. They could hear the intruders cursing in frustration just on the other side of the hidden door. Elias reached for the mechanism, not to open it but to secure it further from this side, a failsafe only he knew. As he worked, one of the intruders, growing impatient, struck the wall with a heavy tool. The sound reverberated through the structure, a terrifying boom that sent a jolt of fear through Alara. "Hey!" Elias shouted suddenly, his voice booming through the barn, deliberately drawing attention away from the back wall. "Get out of my barn!" The intruders whirled around, startled. The lantern light swung wildly. Elias stepped out from behind the hay bales, rifle raised, but not pointed directly at them. He was silhouetted against the faint light from the main doors, a formidable figure. "Thorn!" one of them yelled, his voice nervous. There were indeed 3 of them, rough-looking men Alara didn't recognize. "We just looking around," another stammered. "Get out," Elias repeated, his voice deadly calm, radiating an authority that silenced them for a moment. The man with the lantern, bolder than the others, stepped forward. "We heard you was hiding something, Thorn. Something valuable. In a drought like this, everything's fair game." He took another step. This was the moment. The standoff. Alara knew she had to act. While their attention was focused on Elias, she slipped out from behind the hay bales on the other side, moving silently towards the main barn doors. Her plan was simple, risky, born of desperation. She reached the door and, with a surge of strength fueled by adrenaline, shoved it outwards, throwing it wide open. The sudden influx of moonlight and the screech of the protesting hinges startled the intruders. Their heads whipped towards the sound. "What the?" Alara didn't wait. She grabbed a pitchfork leaning nearby and, with a wild cry, charged into the open space between the intruders and the main doors, waving the pitchfork erratically. She wasn't trying to fight them, just to create chaos, a distraction, to make herself look like a terrified, unpredictable obstacle blocking their escape or their path further into the barn. It worked. The men, momentarily unnerved by the sudden appearance of the rancher's wife, with a weapon and a scream, hesitated. Elias seized the moment. "Last chance," he warned, leveling the rifle slightly higher. "Get out." Now the combination of Alara's unexpected appearance, her desperate, wild energy, and Elias's calm, armed threat proved decisive. They were outnumbered by the owners, caught in the open. The leader with the lantern snarled, looking from Alara to Elias, weighing the risk. The water seekers stirring softly below ground, disturbed by the noise, let out a series of low, resonant calls that echoed faintly in the barn. The intruders heard it. Their eyes widened. The sounds were strange, compelling, confirming their suspicions of something hidden, something alive. But facing Elias's rifle and Alara's frantic, unpredictable defense, they chose the safer option. "This ain't over, Thorn," the leader spat, but he backed away. The 3 men turned and scrambled out the main doors, disappearing into the night. Elias didn't fire. He held the rifle steady until the sounds of their retreating horses faded into the wind. Alara stood trembling, the pitchfork still clutched in her hands. Elias lowered the rifle and walked swiftly to her side. He didn't speak, but his hand reached out, covering hers on the pitchfork handle, his grip firm and reassuring. His pale eyes met hers in the moonlight, filled not with his usual reserve, but with something akin to awe and perhaps relief. She had faced the danger head-on, not just for her family's sake anymore, but for him, for the water seekers, for the future they were trying to build. They stood there together in the silent barn, the moonlight streaming through the open doors, the faint sounds of the hidden heard below comforting in the aftermath of the threat. The secret was safe, for now, and they had protected it together. The fight had been won not just with a rifle, but with courage, quick thinking, and the silent, unwavering partnership forged between a man and a woman who had found each other in the desolate heart of a dying land. The air felt different after that night. Cleaner, somehow, despite the omnipresent dust. The immediate threat had receded, leaving behind a quiet tension, a lingering awareness of the danger they faced, but also a deepened sense of security in their shared purpose. Alara's act of courage in the barn had been a turning point. Elias looked at her differently now. The last vestiges of the distant stranger were gone, replaced by respect and a quiet understanding that went beyond words. They moved around each other with an ease that had been absent before, their tasks flowing into a shared rhythm. They still spoke little, but the silence was companionable, filled with the nonverbal language of partnership. A shared glance, a confirming nod, a hand reaching out to help without being asked. The vulnerability Alara had shown in her fear, coupled with the fierce determination she had displayed in the face of danger, had unlocked something in Elias. He began to share more of his thoughts, not just about the water seekers, but about the land, his hopes for its recovery, the challenges he faced. He spoke of the long years of drought, the neighbors who had given up and moved on, the relentless cycle of hope and disappointment. He spoke of his grandfather, the man who had first told him about the water seekers and their connection to the land's hidden waters. Alara listened, offering quiet understanding, sometimes sharing observations of her own. She spoke of her family, their struggles, the weight of responsibility that had led her to accept his offer. She spoke of her initial fear, her loneliness, her gradual understanding of him and his secret world. They were two solitary souls, finally finding a way to connect, to build a life together not just out of necessity, but out of shared purpose and a growing, quiet affection. The drought, though still present, seemed less insurmountable. The water seekers continued to thrive in their hidden sanctuary, a living testament to resilience. Elias followed their subtle cues, discovering areas on his land where the water table remained surprisingly high, allowing him to maintain his well and even locate new, albeit small, sources. This knowledge, gleaned from the animals, was their advantage, their quiet defiance against the dying world. Alara found a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. The timid girl who had arrived on the ranch, driven by fear and desperation, had been forged in the crucible of hardship and danger into a capable, resilient woman. She could face the harsh sun, the relentless wind, the threat of discovery, and stand tall. Her partnership with Elias was not one of dominance or submission, but of equals, working side by side to protect their fragile world. One evening, as they sat outside the house, watching the bruised colors of twilight deepen on the horizon, Elias spoke, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "My grandfather. He believed the land remembers," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Remembers the rain, the growth, the animals that walked it. He said these water seekers, they are part of that memory, keeping them alive. It's helping the land remember how to live." Alara looked at him, seeing the deep conviction in his eyes. "Perhaps he was right," she said softly. "Look at them. They live, even when everything else struggles." He turned his head then, his pale eyes meeting hers in the fading light. He reached out a hand, rough and calloused, and gently took hers. It wasn't a lover's embrace, but a gesture of connection, of shared journey, of quiet trust. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice low and sincere, "for staying, for understanding, for everything." Alara squeezed his hand, her heart full. She had come here a stranger, bought and sold to save her family. She had found a life she never could have imagined, a partnership built on a dangerous secret and the quiet resilience of two people facing down a dying world. The future was still uncertain. The drought might continue. The threat of discovery lingered, but they would face it together. They had found hope in the most unexpected place, nurtured it in secrecy, and defended it with courage. Their marriage, born of dust and desperation, had taken root, deep and strong, like the hidden waters that sustained the water seekers, holding the promise of life in the heart of the parched land. And Alara, the woman who had married a stranger to save her family, had not only saved them, but had also found herself a quiet strength, a deep connection, and a fragile, resilient hope blooming in the most desolate of landscapes. The wind still whispered its dry song, but now, she heard in it not just the sound of desolation, but the quiet murmur of hidden life, the promise of rain yet to come, and the steady beat of two hearts bound together by shared secrets and a future they were building, day by arduous day, together.